everyone. Welcome to the A&A eLearning Academy. Today we have Michael Kotis, who will be presenting on Virtus and Victoria, coins relating to the Severan War against the tribes of Caledonia. If you have any questions during this presentation, you will be muted, so please put them in the Q&A or the chat, and I will read them to Michael at the end. And without further ado, go ahead, Michael.
Thanks, Logan. So the talk that you are attending is called Virtus and Victoria, coins relating to the Severan War against the tribes of Caledonia. And before we start, I just want to let you know what we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be looking at some historical context first. So what are the events that led to the striking of the coins that we'll be discussing? Next, we'll define the terms Virtus and Victoria as we begin looking at some coins. Now going forward during the presentation, I'll pronounce Virtus using the Latin pronunciation rather than Virtus, but I'll pronounce Victoria as Victoria. And the reason for this is because there's no direct translation of Virtus into English. And so to me, Virtus just sounds odd. But there is a direct translation of Victoria into English, and we're used to hearing it pronounced Victoria. So please forgive me if I mispronounce any Latin words during the presentation. I'm neither a native speaker of Latin, nor am I a scholar of Latin. So all the coins shown are in my own collection. All are stored off-site in a safe deposit box. I will be including some discussion of rarity, but I won't be talking about pricing. The market is variable. Coins are, prices for coins vary widely depending on all kinds of subjective factors as well, such as condition and strike and rarity and stuff like that. But just bear in mind that just because a coin is rare doesn't necessarily mean it's valuable. It depends on demand and those sorts of factors. But if you're thinking of building a collection of the coins, types of coins that we're going to be looking at, you can find retail prices for similar coins on sites such as vCoins and MA Shops. That's MA-shops. CNGcoins.com has a searchable database of past auction prices. And I'm not endorsing these sites, but they are good resources for researching prices. So let's get into the presentation. Let's see if oh, there we go, okay. During the early 3rd century AD, the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, who reigned from 193 to 211, conducted a war against the tribal inhabitants of Caledonia. These tribes, called the Caledonii and the Metii, or Mete, were viewed by the Romans as uncivilized barbarians. Caledonia corresponds roughly with the territory encompassing present-day Scotland. The war began in 208 with Severus's arrival in Britannia, following reports of violent barbarian incursions. Establishing his headquarters at Eboracum, which is present-day York, England, he gathered a huge invading force of more than 50,000 men. Severus was accompanied by his wife Julia Domna and sons and co-rulers Caracalla and Geta. The Severans embarked on campaigns in Caledonia during 209 and 210 and declared victory. The war ended in 211 with Severus's death by illness and the return of his family to Rome. In AD 122, the Emperor Hadrian had overseen the construction of a 73-mile wall to protect and regulate the Roman frontier in northern Britain. Another more northerly wall was built from 142 to 154 by Antoninus Pius, a later Roman emperor after Hadrian. Both walls sustained heavy damage from barbarian attacks during the reign of Septimius Severus, whose legionaries repaired them in 208. So the campaign of AD 209 advanced along Deer Street beyond Hadrian's wall. After crossing the Firth of Forth at Cramond, the army split into two. Caracalla led his legionaries along the highland boundary fault to seal the highlands against enemy reinforcements. Meanwhile, the forces under Septimius Severus attacked the tribes of the Midland Valley. The campaign of 210 repeated the same routes. As the Severan army advanced through Britain in AD 209, the soldiers were faced with grim conditions. They struggled to overcome inhospitable terrain and were forced to fight a guerrilla war. When tribal leaders sued for peace, the Romans annexed territory and stationed garrisons. In 210, Caracalla led a second campaign to crush a Métis revolt and was successful enough to achieve lasting peace. Septimius Severus died at Eboracum on 4 February 211, and he never fulfilled his ambition to conquer the entire island. The talk discusses coins relating to the war conducted from AD 208 to 211 by the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus and his sons Caracalla and Geta against these tribal inhabitants of Caledonia. The intent here is not to put forth a comprehensive history of the war. It is to examine coins which illustrate the concepts of virtus and victoria within the context of this war and which were issued contemporaneously with it. And there's not a great place to insert this rarity scale, but I figured it should go here before we start looking at a lot of coins. So I'm going to be notating, or with the descriptions of the coins, I'm going to be notating rarity, and I'm using two different rarity scales. On the left is a publication called Coinage of Septimius Severus and His Family by Philip V. Hill. That's the one I'm going to be using for silver coins called denarii. So to determine rarity, Hill studied 26 hoards of mostly silver coins, with the largest containing 81,000, more than 81,000 coins. For bronze coins, imperial bronze coins, that is coins minted at Rome, I'm going to be using the book called Roman Imperial Coinage, or abbreviated as RIC. It's a standard reference, and the rarity was determined by examining coins found in major public and private European collections. Both publications are fairly old and somewhat out of date, so the rarity scale, I would say, especially in RIC, is somewhat dated and not incredibly accurate, and yet still that's a standard. And you know, it's about relative rarity, so this is not absolute rarity. Absolute rarity would be that we know that there's a certain number of coins minted, or a certain number of coins that are definitely still surviving, and we know that, you know, there's 500 of this type and there's one that exists, and, you know, then we know absolutely that how rare it is. But these are relative, so we have to bear that in mind. So typically rarity scales include C for common, the letter C for common, S for scarce, and R for rare. None of the coins that we'll be looking at during the presentation are rated as common. So there's no need to include the C part of the scales here. So both of these scales go from C to S to R. For scarce to rare coins, the small numbers next to the letters indicate degrees of scarcity or rarity. The higher the number, the more scarce or rare. And I don't expect that you're going to memorize the scale, even though, you know, I'm showing it to you, it's pretty detailed. You're not going to memorize this as we go through the presentation, but I'm including the notations of rarity, and so you can keep in mind as you see the descriptions, as I show you the coins, keep in mind that S is less rare than R. And if you see something like an R3 or an R4, for example, it means that there's not too many of those out there. So now for the provincial coins, I'm going to be showing some coins that were minted in the provinces later in the presentation. I'm not including rarity with those because those are all, there's just various references and they don't all contain rarity scales, and it's difficult to get something that would be not too confusing, but the provincial coins that I'll be showing are all pretty rare. So just bear that in mind as well. And as I did mention that the rarity scales for ancient coins are relative rather than absolute. There are no surviving mint records from ancient Roman times that tell us the mintage numbers. But if a particular type appears once or twice in a sample of something like 100,000 coins, then it's usually going to be pretty hard to find. So like in the, the Hill reference, R4 says there's 0 to 1 in his sampling of, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 coins. You know that's going to be hard to find. All right, so let's define this term virtus. The Latin word virtus connotes qualities of manly excellence such as courage, character, strength, and valor. Military success was invariably credited to the emperor's virtus. And the English word virtue, it comes from this word Latin virtus. Virtus was sometimes personified as a woman dressed in military attire. Yet, especially in this era, virtus is more often embodied in depictions of the emperor himself dominating a foe, and we'll see some depictions like that later. The Romans personified the concept of Victoria, or victory, as the winged goddess Victoria. Did I skip over something? I feel, no, I didn't. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought maybe I skipped a slide. Okay. Martial imagery, and martial means having to do with war, warlike, from the god Mars. Martial imagery such as bound captives, battlefield trophies, and piles of captured arms also symbolize victory and are frequently shown alongside Victoria as part of the same design. So in this coin of Caracalla, we have a winged victory. She's affixing a shield to a palm tree, and her foot is on a helmet. So I would say this is there's some martial imagery in this on this coin. So virtus and Victoria. These personifications are sometimes shown in combination with figures representing Severus and his sons Caracalla and Geta, who in 210 had earned the title of Britannicus Maximus, or the great victor of Britain. So back to our coin of Septimius Severus with virtus as a woman dressed in military attire. Severus himself is shown. He's holding a spear, a grounded or reversed spear. You can see the point is on the ground, and that symbolizes peace. Virtus is standing behind him, about to crown him with a laurel wreath, and then in Severus's right hand, he's holding a small figure of Victoria, and we can make out that she has wings and she's holding a wreath, a laurel wreath. The virtus of the emperor. War and politics were inseparable in ancient Rome. The word emperor derives from the Latin imperator, meaning general, and the emperor's legitimacy was largely based on his success as a military leader. His virtus in the form of courageous military exploits was thus viewed as key to victory for the Roman state. Images of the emperor on horseback, charging into battle, or trampling a fallen enemy visualize the concept of virtus as embodied in his personal exercise of martial force. So this coin of Caracalla, we're looking at the reverse, and we can see Caracalla on horseback. He's brandishing a spear. He's about to spear this enemy below him, being trampled by the horse's hooves. And if we look at the description, you can see a little R next to the RIC number, and that indicates that this is a rare coin. So to emphasize his power, the figure of the emperor is disproportionately large compared to the diminutive foeman he is about to vanquish. So if you look at Caracalla's head, for example, compared to the little enemy's head, there's quite a difference. Caracalla's head is quite a bit larger. So he's more powerful, more important. He's dominating his enemy. Emperor on horseback motifs were particularly popular on coins of Septimius Severus, Caracalla, and Geta, struck during the Severan invasion of Britain. Yet these depictions do not constitute a documentary record of actual events. Literary accounts and archaeological evidence point to their derivative nature, and they must instead be interpreted as the continuation of a standardized iconographic language developed under previous emperors. So I've been showing this print of an ancient Roman relief sculpture, and I have next to it the coin that I was just showing in the last slide, but I have the coin flipped so that it orients, it's going left to right. The horse is oriented left to right as it is in the relief sculpture. And if we think about how a coin would be struck from a die, and the coin is the reverse image of the image on the die, if the die maker was referring to a relief sculpture such as this, most of them are going from left to right, and so he would probably engrave it in with the same orientation, and then when the coin was struck, it would flip around and the figure would be going from right to left instead. So, I mean, it's not always the case that the figures are on the coins are going right to left or left to right. I mean, it varies somewhat, but you could see that this type of relief sculpture is fairly close to the way that the emperor on horseback would be depicted on these coins. So here's a gallery of emperor on horseback denarii of Septimius Severus and his sons that were struck between 208 and 210 AD. So just by the context of when they were struck, they would relate to these victories in Britain. We know the dates when they were struck because the legends on the reverses are the emperor's titles, and the numbers in the legends correspond with particular years. So for example, the one on the far left is struck in 208 because the emperor's titles on the reverse match or correspond with that year. Now, the coins of Geta, there's 3 here, and that says, they say early to mid 209, mid 209, and later 209, and you think, well, the titles on the reverse are the same, so how would we know that these were struck, early in the year or later in the year? And, we don't actually 100% know that, but we're going by the portrait style. So at the time, Geta was an adolescent or young adult, and the one struck in mid 209, he's kind of youthful. He's starting to get a bit of a beard. And then the one struck in mid 209, he looks a little bit more mature. His beard is a little bit fuller. And the one struck in later 209, he looks like a mature man, and he's got a very full beard. But also on that one, he became Augustus. He was Caesar in early to mid 209. He was granted the title of Augustus in later 209. So the title of his imperial titles on the reverse of that one from later 209, that also, and the fact that he's wearing a laurel crown also indicates that he's Augustus. So we know that's later 209. So we have the years here, we've got some catalog numbers, and then underneath that I've got the rarity scale. So those rarity scales are based on Hill, and where it says R4, those are very, very, very hard to find. These images are propagandistic fantasies, the emperor on horseback images. Caracalla probably did lead troops from horseback during the Caledonian campaigns, but the barbarians' guerrilla tactics avoided pitched battles. So the scene like this is probably unlikely that a scene like this actually happened with Caracalla trampling a foe. According to the Roman writers Dio and Herodian, Severus was aged and infirm and had to be conveyed in a litter. He would have been too weak to personally engage the enemy from horseback. So this scene is unlikely as well. And Geta had been assigned to administrative duties to be carried out from the Severan headquarters at Eboracum, far from the battlefront. So he was not likely to be in Britain trampling an enemy either. So the cult of Victoria Britannica. The personified deity Victoria Britannica seems to be a specific aspect of the Roman goddess Victoria and therefore essentially the same. Worship of Victoria Britannica is known from the evidence of inscriptions dating to the victory in Britain achieved by the Emperor Claudius in AD 43. The cult was an offshoot of the imperial cult and thus focused primarily on the veneration of the emperor himself. After the death of Claudius, the cult diminished in importance until the goddess appeared on a series of coins struck under Antoninus Pius in AD 143 to 44, or to 144. The most famous and prolific appearance of Victoria Britannica occurs in imperial coins struck under Septimius Severus, Caracalla, and Geta. And these are the reverse legend. Rather than having the emperor's titles, it says Victoriae Brit, which is short for Victoriae Britannicae, meaning victories in Britain. I'll probably refer to them just as Victoriae Brit because it's less awkward than saying Victoriae Britannicae. So, okay. Although coins bearing images of Victoria were perennially popular with the Severans, those relating specifically to the war in Britain are identified by their legends. As I just mentioned, Victoriae Brit. So Victoriae Britannicae, meaning the British victory, and abbreviations thereof, or imperial titles which date the coins between AD 208 and 211. Okay, so here's a gallery of Victoriae Brit types on denarii of Septimius Severus and his sons, which were struck between 210 and 211 AD. So this is a complete set of types, of the main types. If you look at the first one on the left, on the far left, and the last one on the far right, it's the same reverse type, but it's for different emperors. So I'm calling these different types. So if we think of each one of these as a different type, there are 8 total. And if we think about that these would have been struck, the series would have been struck at the same time, we can imagine the mint organization at Rome would have been divided into 8 workshops called officina. And 4 of those workshops were devoted to producing coins, Victoriae Brit coins for Septimius Severus because he was the senior emperor. And then 2 each of these workshops would have been devoted to producing coins for Caracalla and Geta. And I did say that with the rarity scale, I said I didn't include C because none of these coins are common, but I'm putting, Hill does call this RIC 33. It's the one second from the left. He calls it common, but it's not common. So he's an error there. It's pretty rare, actually, that one. So that's just an error from Hill. So there's quite a few die links that we can find in this series, this Victoriae Brit series of denarius. A die link may indicate limited coin production from few dies, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But we can also, why should we bother with looking at coins that were struck from the same die? So anyway, maybe I should define a die link. A die link is a coin that 2 coins or 2 or more coins that were struck from a single reverse die or from a single obverse die. So for example, there are 3 different coins shown on this slide, and there are 3 different, the obverse images were struck from 3 different obverse dies, but the reverses were struck from a single reverse die. So these victories are all the same. If we overlaid them, we would say that they're exactly the same. So they came from the same die. So basically, we've got 3 coins from 3 different obverse dies, but from a single reverse die. And we can find some things out by looking at these. So for example, we can look at how the coin wears, the design on the coin wears, from good, very fine to very fine to near very fine. We can see how the details wear in the design of the coin. So I have a little animation here. Let's see if it'll work. It's going to magically transform this coin from a good, very fine with quite a bit of detail to a near very fine with not so much detail. So let's take a look at it. Let me let it run. So we're at good, very fine with some detail, very fine with a little bit worn with a little less detail, and near very fine with even less detail. And I'm noticing on this that the area of most wear, where the detail is mostly gone from it, is on the right around the waist area where there's drapery. It's looking very flat here. If I go back to the beginning, you can see that there's some more detail there. So it's interesting to see how the die wears, and it's one way that we can use die links. All right. Another thing we can use these die links for is to date a coin. So, typically the standard wisdom is that these Victoriae Brit coins were struck between 210 and 211, or sometime in that time frame. Although they have nothing on here other than the title to date them exactly, but for these 2 coins that I'm showing, they're both struck from the same obverse die. So the portraits on the obverse, if you look at them, they match exactly. But there's two different reverse designs. So one is a Victoriae Brit, and then one is just a Felicitas type, kind of a generic type that's not part of the series. And that has the emperor's titles, and those titles date the coin to 211. So we can confirm that this Victoriae Brit was probably struck in 211. I mean, it's possible that it was struck first, and then, they picked up the extra obverse die and struck this other coin later, but they've probably been struck around the same time frame. So dating is one thing that we can use die links for. And we can also, looking at a die, if I make my own die study, and these are coins that I have found that are die links, I can see that there are 4 different, the coins, these, let's see, what do I have? I've got 4 different coins here, and 4 coins struck from 4 different obverse dies, but from a total of 3 reverse dies. So we have the notation here for the die linkage. O means obverse and R means reverse. So O1, O2, O3, O4, those are 4 different obverses. And then R2, R1, etc. Those are the different reverses. And if we can see that that there are more obverses used than reverses. Now, typically, it's going to be reversed for a typical run of coins where they'd strike many coins. Let's say just a common type. The reverse dies wear out faster than the obverse dies. They need to be replaced because there's more stress on the reverse, because the reverse is struck with a hammer. So the reverse dies tend to break and wear out much more quickly than the obverse dies. And so for a typical coin type, there might be, dozens of different dies used, and it's hard to find die links. And if you do find them, typically you're going to find them with the reverse dies more often than with the obverse dies. But for the Victoriae Brit series, we're finding that more obverse dies are being used than reverse dies, which means that there were very few reverse dies, relatively speaking, very few reverse dies being used, which means it was probably a very limited series. And then the fact that the obverse dies were still in good shape, like O2 here, it was paired with another type that was outside of the series. So the obverse dies were still good after they finished striking the Victoriae Brit type, so they started using it to strike some other coins. And the R1, which is that Felicitas type, looks like it was struck from a worn die. So they probably had already struck that type, and it was sort of left over, and they had a couple dies, and they put them together. And so those are some things that we can kind of speculate. I mean, this is just my speculating based on what I've got here, but it's obviously not fact. But we can learn a lot from finding die links, and it can be really interesting if you're really getting into a series like this, to delve into those sorts of things. All right, so that was a little bit of a tangent. Let's get back to the cult of Victoria Britannica. Severus and his sons were likely granted the title of Britannicus Maximus no earlier than the spring of 210. So Victoria coins bearing reference to this title can be dated from 210 or 211. And if you look at the obverse of this coin of Septimius Severus, his title includes Brit in it, which is short for Britannicus Maximus. And so coins that have that in the emperor's titles were struck no earlier than 210. Now, there are some victory types that do not show Victoriae Britannicae on the reverse, or Victoriae Brit, and they may not have the title Britannicus Maximus, but we can infer from their chronological context that they also refer to the cult of Victoria Britannica. So if we look at this denarius on the right-hand side, it was struck in 211 because the emperor's titles are shown, and that corresponds to the year 211. And also this is a victory standing on the prow of a ship, and ships were used for, supply and troop transport and things like that in Britain. So we can infer from that this coin this Victoria may be also referring to the cult of Victoria Britannica. And the bronze coin on the left, the emperor's title is not, there's no Brit in his title on the obverse, but it's dated to AD 208. So there's a victory with martial imagery there, and it's contemporaneous with the Severan invasion of Britain. All right, so even though they were not granted the title until 210 by the Senate, they would not have waited until their claims of victory could be ratified by the Senate to invoke the goddess for the purpose of advertising their success. So the coin that was struck in 208, the bronze coin, it doesn't have the title Britannicus Maximus on it, and it was struck in 208. But why would Severus wait? Let's talk a little bit about who the Caledonii were. The Caledonii were a confederation of tribal peoples who inhabited northern Britain during ancient times. Although primarily an agrarian society, they fiercely resisted Roman occupation and were never fully conquered. Tattooed Caledonian warriors fought naked and painted themselves blue to terrify their enemies. It seems that the later Romans considered the Picts to be descendants of the Caledonii, but the names may have been used interchangeably. So the print I'm showing is from the 16th century, but I think that the Caledonians looked pretty much like this, or had similar kinds of fear-invoking tattoos. Martial imagery. The Romans were ruthless in warfare and pursued victory with dogged determination. They viewed massacre and atrocity as practical paths to lasting peace. These characteristics are reflected on coins bearing military themes, which originated during the Republic and continued throughout the imperial era. Spoils of war, such as small captive barbarians, often served to accessorize the larger figures of deities or the emperor. So on this coin of Septimius Severus, we can see two large victories attaching a shield to a palm tree, and below them, with their hands tied behind their backs, are two very small captives. And we do see in the legend, it says there's an abbreviation for Victoriae Britannicae. For ancient engravers, wide diameter bronze coins offered an expansive canvas for rendering complex scenes composed of multiple figures and objects. Martial types relating to the Severan invasion of Britain are mostly adaptations of standard themes developed over centuries. So in this relief sculpture, the image that I'm showing, this is from 29 BC, well before the Severan invasion of Britain, but it shows the captives with their hands tied behind their backs, sitting below a post, and we have a similar kind of image still being used during the Severan era. As tangible physical objects connected to this remote chapter of the past, the coins that survive are of great historical interest. A few even depict idealized versions of actual events. On the Sestertius of Caracalla, for example, Severus and his sons stand amongst a group of soldiers. Emphasizing their power and virtus, the emperors loom over a captive. Could this scene record the victorious aftermath of the Caledonian campaign of AD 210? And the description here, it says Septimius Severus and Caracalla, Geta is in the background. He's just visible between them. Standing left in military dress, he holds a transverse spear in his hand. Before them, two soldiers, one standing facing, holding a vertical spear, the other stand facing, also holding a standard. At the feet of the soldiers, captive is seated right. Now, this doesn't look like a whole lot, but if we enhance this with color, the figures start to become more apparent, or the details become more apparent. So now we can see Geta in yellow, Caracalla, Severus, the captive, and the two soldiers. So this is quite a worn coin. It's a very rare coin, so it's very hard to find in better condition than this. Another thing with this coin that makes it a little bit difficult to read is that it was double struck. So it's got evidence of double strike on it. And when I highlighted the legend, for example, some of the letters are a little bit muddled up. And if you look at the SC below the ground line, you'll see below the C there's an extension. There's the the double strike. You can see the C in there too. And if you look at the figures of Severus and Caracalla, you can see kind of a double, like their torso is doubled, so I think that the colorization helps to read this coin. So here's a gallery of imperial bronzes bearing martial imagery. And, these also have, most of them have victory. In fact, if I look at these, all of them have a figure of victory aside from the one that we just looked at. So you could call these victory types or Victoriae, Britannicae types as well. But I just find it interesting that some of them, especially the bronzes that have a larger canvas, canvas, quote unquote, show military themed, more military themes on them. And I'm defining martial type also here. I say that it may include depictions of captives and other spoils of war, such as helmets, armor, shields, and weapons. Equipment can be arranged as trophies or otherwise displayed. Representations of Victoria, the emperor, soldiers, and military standards are also common. So now we'll take a look at some provincial coins, calling this section Provincial Propaganda. The Roman state granted authority to provincial cities of the Greek East for the minting of local coinage. Provincial coin reverses were typically dedicated to subjects of civic interest, such as temples, deities, mythological scenes, and cult objects of local significance. Yet most cities struck a proportion of their coinage with propagandistic imagery devoted to venerating the imperial cult, which worshiped the emperor and ruling dynasty. So on this coin of Serdica in Thrace, we have a coin struck in 211 or around 211 AD, a coin of Caracalla. And the legends are in Greek, and I'm not going to attempt to translate those, but the figures on here show Caracalla and Geta. They both have their foot on a tiny captive, and they're standing facing a trophy of captured arms. Now the trophy commemorates victory, and Caracalla is holding a reversed spear, which signifies peace. And the coin can be dated from the obverse image of the emperor, which I'm not actually showing here, but the portrait style showing Caracalla as a mature man with a full beard dates to about 211. Images of Nike, who is the Greek equivalent to Victoria, or depictions of the emperor demonstrating his virtus, were meant to foster a sense of confidence in the power of the emperor and the strength of the Roman military. Most provincial cities of the Eastern Roman Empire were governed under Hellenistic law, thus most Eastern coinages bear Greek legends. Some cities, such as Antioch in Pisidia and Stobi in Macedonia, carried the honor of ius Italicum, or Italic law, by which their citizens enjoyed the privilege of Roman citizenship. So here we have a coin of Stobi on the right and a coin of Antioch and Pisidia on the left. One shows victory, winged victory, and the other is showing the emperor on horseback, similar to those denarii that we looked at earlier. So these cities, Stobi and Antioch and Pisidia, there's more than one Antioch, that's why I'm specifying Pisidia. These cities were governed under Roman law, and their coins were struck with Latin legends. So, how do we date this? So the Latin legend on the reverse basically is saying the city of Stobi. But we're dating this based on the obverse portrait style, which resembles portraits on imperial issues that date from 209 to 212. So this coin would have been struck around that same time period, 209 to 12, and the victory would be referring to the Severan victories in Caledonia. So on this coin, we're seeing Geta on horseback. He's preparing to hurl a spear at his fallen enemy, and he's trampling another. And the Latin legend on the reverse translates as courageous emperor of our masters, Antioch. So some coins of Pasitian Antioch, which commemorate the Caledonian campaigns. They were struck between AD 209 and 212. All of these are quite rare. Something interesting on these is the obverse die linkage of the two Geta coins on the left. Both have similar reverse types. On the description on the top left-hand one, it says Geta is on horseback charging. But on the description of the lower left-hand one, it says Caracalla is on horseback charging, and you might think, well, why is a Caracalla charging on horseback on the reverse where Geta is on the obverse? How do you know who's who? Well, I mean, we know it's Geta because we see Geta in the title on the obverse, but on the reverse, according to the catalog, the kind of the authoritative catalog on these coins, and I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce that name, starting with a K. The majority of these coins struck with that particular die are coins of Geta, or I'm sorry, coins of Caracalla. So Caracalla is on the obverse, and the fact that there's a few coins struck from the same die that were paired with a Geta obverse means that, according to the cataloger, that it's actually Caracalla on horseback on the reverse. All right, so on the right-hand side, we have some victory types. And something really interesting to point out, this one is dated to 211 AD. And we know this because on the reverse legend, under the legend that says, where it says DDNN, as an abbreviation for Dominorum Nostrorum, which means our masters, the double D and double N indicate that there were two emperors at the same time. And so the only year that there were two emperors was 211. As Septimius Severus had died, so it was Geta and Caracalla who were co-emperors at that time. So the DDNN refers to them, so it would have been struck in 211. I mean, there's one source says Geta was killed in December 211, and one says he was killed in early 212, but so I'd say 211. And then the one below it says it was struck around 212. That's a coin of Caracalla, and it does not have the doubling of DD or NN in it. So that would indicate a single, that there was a single emperor, and so Caracalla was sole emperor in 212. So those some information about how these are being dated. So in conclusion, the extent to which the Virtus and Victoria advertise on Severan coinage adhere to historical truth is not entirely certain. Literary accounts by ancient authors can be vague, incomplete, conflicting, and biased, just like modern times. Despite the evidence of archaeology and other fields, much remains lost to the mists of time. What is clear is that the Virtus and Victoria coin types struck under the Severans have been adapted from established patterns of visual representation developed under previous emperors. They bear time-tested propagandistic imagery meant to show the emperor, the ruling dynasty, and the Roman military in the best possible light. So here's a bibliography. And I think I'm ready for questions if there are any.
Okay, there's no questions yet, but just a reminder for everyone viewing, if you would like to ask a question, you can put it in the Q&A or the chat, and I will read it to Michael. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I've seen your exhibits and obviously read your applications for your exhibits on this. Okay. It's interesting to see it in a different format.
Thank you. Yeah, this is based on an exhibit, but it goes into quite a bit more detail than the exhibit. So.
Yeah, and you always win with it. So you seem to have won all the judges over with that exhibit. Oh, I hear about it quite a bit.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm ready for questions. Come on, somebody give me a question.
Yeah, come on, get some questions.
Maybe I was too thorough.
Again, in the chat or the Q&A, you can ask some questions, and I will read them to Michael for him to answer. If not, I'll give it about one more minute, and if not, we'll go ahead and sign off. It just might mean you did a great job explaining everything.
Well, I hope that's what it means.
Yeah. So far, so good. So
I have to have missed something. I'm sure I did.
Maybe.
Maybe someone can correct my Latin pronunciations.
Maybe. I never learned Latin either, so it wouldn't be me to correct you.
Oh, I think I see one.
Oh, there we go. Yep. Okay, so first question, what made you start on this series?
It was a long time ago. So I bought the first coin, the Victoriae Brit denarii, one of those little denariis with the British victory on the reverse, back around 2003. And I was intrigued by the history of the era. I had already been collecting some Severan coinage, that particular era, and I knew some history about it, and I just kind of kept digging into it, and I saw a coin for sale that had this Victoriae Brit, and it's fascinating to me because it's kind of an obscure event. I mean, most people, we don't learn about this in school. I mean, at least not in America, maybe in Britain or something. But it's kind of obscure. Not too many people know about it, and yet it's really fascinating. And at least to me it was. And just any coin that's connected with a specific historical event, it's almost like time travel. To hold this in your hand and you just think, wow, this made it all the way from 2,000 years into my hand, and it's a physical manifestation, like a physical remnant of something that is just so far in the past. So and I think it might be a lot of people, once you get one or two of these, you start getting more and more into it, and eventually you want to complete the series or whatever. So that's how
next question, sorry. Have these coins held their value over time, or have they just decreased?
All right, so I did say I wasn't going to discuss pricing and value. However, they have increased for the most part. Now, it's just like any other numismatic area that they always say buy the best you can afford. So maybe ones that are in poor condition, maybe they've decreased because they held their value. But ones that are more exceptional, in better condition, rarer, rarity and good condition and good strike and good style. And also some of these have a pretty distinguished provenance. So sometimes, those go for more. So I would say most of them would be, at least let's just talk about the denarii. Most of them have maybe increased over the last 10, 15 years. Bronzes are harder because there's such a range of condition on those. It's too varied to really say for sure, but in general, things have increased. So just like the rest of the coin market, especially lately since COVID. I mean,
yes, I've heard. I think that's all of the questions.
Okay.
So thank you again, Michael, for such a wonderful and educational program. And for all of you who attended, we hope to see you guys on some more webinars in the future, and we'll see you then. Thanks.
Thank you very much.